Australia has long been celebrated as the lucky country, a phrase that symbolized endless prosperity, stability, natural wealth, and a high quality of life. But decades ago, one of Asia's sharpest minds, Singapore's founding father Lee Kuan Yew, quietly warned that Australia's luck was not permanent, and today, when we examine the housing crisis, economic dependence, productivity stagnation, and policy failures, his warning appears more prophetic than pessimistic. Because Australia's collapse is not a sudden disaster waiting to happen but a slow-burn structural decline unfolding in plain sight, especially through housing, which has transformed from a basic human need into a speculative asset class that now threatens the nation's social fabric. As home prices have surged far beyond wage growth, locking younger generations out of ownership while enriching a narrow class of investors, creating a feudal-like economy where renters fund landlords. And this distortion is not accidental but the result of decades of political choices that favored short-term gains over long-term sustainability. As governments encouraged negative gearing, capital gains tax discounts, and mass immigration without matching infrastructure or housing supply, pushing demand relentlessly upward while supply lagged. And Lee Kuan Yew once observed that Australia relied too heavily on luck rather than discipline, reform, and competitiveness, warning that without productivity, skills development, and strategic planning, prosperity would erode. And today Australia's economy remains dangerously dependent on housing, mining, and China, with housing alone accounting for a massive share of household wealth and bank balance sheets, meaning any serious correction would ripple through the entire financial system, exposing how fragile the lucky country really is. While wages have stagnated for over a decade, productivity growth has slowed to near historic lows, and young Australians face a future where stable employment no longer guarantees security, as rent consumes an ever larger portion of income, forcing families to delay children, education, and long-term planning, hollowing out the middle class that once defined Australian society. And this is where Lee Kuan Yew's critique cuts deepest, because he believed nations survive not through resource abundance but through human capital, governance, and adaptability, areas where Australia has increasingly fallen behind as universities become migration pipelines rather than innovation hubs. Vocational skills are neglected, and political debate revolves around preserving house prices rather than building a competitive economy. And the housing crisis is not isolated but interconnected with migration policy, where record-high immigration is used to prop up GDP numbers while ignoring per capita decline, infrastructure strain, and housing shortages, creating the illusion of growth while living standards quietly fall, a classic case of what economists call population Ponzi economics. And as Lee Kuan Yew warned, relying on luck invites complacency. And Australia's complacency is visible in how policymakers refuse to confront vested interests, particularly property investors and banks, whose influence ensures reforms remain cosmetic rather than structural, because meaningful housing reform would require political courage to upset asset holders. Yet without it, inequality widens, social cohesion weakens, and resentment grows, creating fertile ground for political instability. While the global environment becomes harsher, with rising interest rates exposing over-leveraged households, climate risks threatening coastal property, and geopolitical shifts reducing demand for Australian commodities, especially as China diversifies its supply chains, revealing the vulnerability of an economy that failed to diversify in time. And Lee Kuan Yew understood geopolitics deeply, noting that countries without strategic foresight are punished by global forces. And Australia now faces a world where cheap money is gone, globalization is fragmenting, and productivity matters more than ever. Yet its policy framework remains stuck in the 1990s, assuming housing prices will always rise and migration will always save the economy, while ignoring that a society cannot function when teachers, nurses, and police cannot afford to live near their workplaces, turning cities into playgrounds for investors rather than communities. And this housing distortion also fuels mental health crises, declining birth rates, and intergenerational conflict, as young Australians feel betrayed by a system that promised fairness but delivered exclusion, eroding trust in institutions. And history shows that societies fracture not from sudden collapse but from prolonged injustice. And Lee Kuan Yew believed that legitimacy comes from performance, not rhetoric, meaning, when governments fail to deliver rising living standards, stability erodes. And Australia's political class increasingly relies on slogans rather than solutions, while the banking sector remains dangerously exposed to residential mortgages, making any housing downturn a systemic risk rather than a manageable correction. And this risk is amplified by household debt levels among the highest in the world, meaning Australia is uniquely vulnerable to interest rate shocks, job losses, or external crises. And yet the national conversation remains dominated by protecting house prices, a sign that the country has confused wealth with productivity, assets with innovation, and consumption with progress, precisely the mindset Lee Kuan Yew warned against, because he believed nations must constantly reinvent themselves or decline. And Australia's failure to do so is visible in underinvestment in advanced manufacturing, technology, and value-added industries, choosing instead to dig, sell, and speculate, a model that worked when China was booming and money was cheap but now faces structural limits. And as housing absorbs capital that could have gone into productive investment, the economy becomes less dynamic. Startups struggle, entrepreneurship declines, and risk-taking gives way to rent-seeking behavior, where buying property becomes more rational than building businesses, slowly draining the nation's innovative capacity. And this is how collapse begins, not with riots or bank runs but with stagnation, frustration, and declining opportunity, as the myth of the lucky country masks a reality of rising inequality and falling mobility. And Lee Kuan Yew's warning was never that Australia would collapse overnight, but that without discipline, reform, and foresight, luck would run out, and today the signs are unmistakable: a housing system that enriches the few and burdens the many, an economy dependent on external demand and internal speculation, a political system captured by vested interests, and a society where young people increasingly feel the future is close to them. And unless Australia confronts the housing crisis at its root by reforming tax incentives, boosting supply intelligently, aligning migration with infrastructure, and shifting investment toward productivity and innovation, the slow erosion will continue, transforming the lucky country into a cautionary tale of how abundance can breed complacency, and how ignoring warnings from history as sharpest observers can lead a nation not to dramatic collapse but to something quieter and perhaps more tragic: the gradual loss of fairness, opportunity, and confidence in the future, exactly as Lee Kuan Yew foresaw when he cautioned that luck is never a substitute for leadership, discipline, and long-term vision.